Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be having an interview with F-Secure, who are one of the leading security experts you can find. So, would you like to introduce yourselves, and then we can start with the interview?
Hi, so I'm Jeff Dorrington, F-Secure's PR manager for UK and Ireland.
And I'm Tom Gaffney, and I am a security consultant. I've been here for 10 years, which is way too long in the IT world.
Fair enough. And so I guess the first question we should ask is, would you like to kind of tell us a little bit more about F-Secure and the services that you provide and what your levels of expertise would be?
Sure. So we've been going for 30 years. We actually have our 30th anniversary in a big celebration a couple of weeks ago in Finland. Started back then as a company called Data Fellows in the late 80s, supporting corporate environments in a time when the threats were fairly minimal and your AV and your protection came through floppy disks on a LAN. Obviously a lot of them, so the old 3.5ers. And we survived and grown as the years have gone by, because, as I guess a lot of your audience know, the security threats and vulnerabilities, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, are becoming ever more prevalent. And we initially started out supporting businesses, ran like that until the late 90s, then produced a consumer version of our product. And in 2000, the company took a strategic decision to offer our services through internet service providers. And that's predominantly where most of our revenues have come since then. So if you are in the UK and you're a TalkTalk customer or a Virgin Media customer, for example, you get a endpoint security for your home device, your phone or your tablet or your PC, and that comes that's actually provided by F-Secure. And we have partners all over the world: Vodafone, Liberty Global, Telia, a bunch of ISPs around the world. We also, in more recent years, and we've always had kept the business part of the business going, providing predominantly in the old days endpoint detection. When we say endpoint for businesses, we mean obviously more than just your actual device you're using, but servers, messaging gateways, that kind of thing. And we've seen a huge increase in demand for those kind of services in the last few years, as criminals are really going after enterprises and businesses of all kinds in a big way. So we expanded that product set significantly over the last few years to include more corporate scalable type services. And again, we'll talk about this as we get into the technology a bit more.
Yeah, exactly.
The threat model has changed. So, sorry. We are, like a lot of other companies, making a lot of growth through acquisition. Actually, the last 2 years we've acquired 4-5 companies, which add to us different skill sets and resources, because one of the big challenges that we have, all security companies have, is finding the right resources. So guys who have the skills are tough to find, and that's why UK government and governments around the world are increasingly putting investment into education and trying to get people schooled in how to protect against cyber threats.
Yeah, because I guess that kind of leads us to the next question. Do you feel that, I mean, obviously, as you said, you guys have been in this business for 3 decades, but now that big data, online banking, shopping, do you feel that customers are more switched on and kind of engaged with protection and their own security than what they were, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago?
I'd say there's a bit of a divide here between consumers and businesses. So this might sound counterintuitive, but we do have some evidence of research that we've done with our operator partners. There is a small increase with consumers in the types of threats that they face and the level of protection they need. So one of our partners, I can't name them here, but they ran a survey with their own customers in 2015, then repeated it in 2017. And they discovered that back then the awareness of threats, even relatively recent, was quite low, and the need for security. So it was about a third of people thought they needed something. And then if you ask them why, it was generally because they didn't understand what the threat level was, or they didn't know what was the security product to go with. You're okay. And also people who had Apple devices and had a high perception that they weren't a threat. Then the follow-up survey in 2017 asked pretty much the same questions, and that had flipped quite a lot. And that might be because of we've had some really high-profile attacks in the last 12 months, which, security stories are always out there, but they're not always picked up by the media. But we've had some really big ones, obviously, WannaCry, and then the stuff that's hit with the chipsets lately as well. So maybe that awareness is a bit more in people's minds. Plus also, particularly on Macs, we've seen a lot of exploits taking place. So we'd seen a switch between 2015 and 17 where people who had Apple devices, it was up to about a third who realized they needed some level of protection.
Sorry. So would you say that it's very similar on the business side as well?
Yeah, again, we see a bit more split. We'd say at a medium size upwards, it's a complete change. Now, gone is the day where companies don't understand that they've got to have decent security in place. I'd say down at the smaller business level, so talking 1 to 30 or 1 to 50 seats, it's a bit more similar to the residential world.
Yeah,
not quite.
I've actually been to a couple of companies. I mean, I'm not like a security expert, but I was doing more, I guess you could say, general IT, and I was also helping them with like marketing or whatever. And some companies, the security was terrible. I mean, one company I was working with, the password to one of their servers was literally password, and that would allow them access to like their client database. And although it wasn't my job, I said to them, like, you really need to fix this because this is just terrible. You're just, like, you're so open and vulnerable. I said, look, I'm going to give it a once over, but I'm not a security expert. You need to bring someone in to actually resolve these issues because, first of all, you're breaking data compliance laws, and second of all, like, this is just ridiculous.
That's one of the positives about GDPR, and also the UK government has been pretty good in driving standards. Previously, it was only if you were in some sort of financial related industry where there was a legal or a statutory requirement to have good security in place. There's a lot of faults with the GDPR, the requirements that are going to come in May or are already in place, some of them already. But one of the things it does do is obviously force companies that are containing personal user data to at least have some kind of security policies in place. And that will be a big game changer.
You said there's faults. What do you feel the issues are, if you don't mind me asking? Do you feel they're too lax?
Personally, I feel it's a little heavy-handed in its implementation. There is some of the requirements are requiring data to be stored for considerable lengths of time. It can't be implemented without significant cost to almost any business, and we at F-Secure are very aware of that because we're doing our own compliance and going through those steps with us. So we can get an idea of what it looks like for our business, but we could sort of take a similar snapshot and extrapolate that across other businesses and scales and say, for a lot of people, this is going to change their entire ways of working.
Wow. Most people have a cell phone with them 24/7. Would you? And it's surprising how many people don't even have a passcode on their device. So I guess with mobile phones in mind, if you were just to give generic advice, free tips, I suppose, or habits even, what would you suggest for smartphone users? You can separate this between Android and iOS or however you want to do it. What would you suggest to improve their safety and security offline and online, and perhaps even if they've had their smartphones stolen?
I really like the way you separated that between tips and habits, by the way. So I kind of have a bit of a bugbear when within the security industry of struggle to get engagement with people across the board, unless they see the need for security, and we make it over convoluted or complicated for them. And I kind of firmly believe that there is no silver bullet, to use that cliche, in terms of a security solution. It's not just one security solution that's going to fix your problem. We obviously are a security company, so we're pushing our solutions to do that. But it really comes down to, as you said, habits or behaviors. So I think it's partly behavior driven and partly tools. From a behavior perspective, you called out one straight away there in terms of not using passcodes. certainly you need to employ some kind of passcode. And I would, depending on the model, and this would be more of an Android tip, I would urge people not to rely on swiping, but to use actual PIN codes as their method of accessing, because there are various ways for a smart criminal to guess what the swipe codes are. Also, there is really good research done by people who are super geeky into passwords, and it's quite common to guess people's swipes or passwords if you know a bit about them. And
really?
Just to give you like a tiny example of that, and a lot of this depends. This is a trick you can play with people, or just ask them if they use the pattern message. It's something like it's more than 90% of people's pattern passwords will start at the top left-hand side of the screen.
Really?
I've done this with a number of people who as a really rubbish party trick, and they're a bit shocked at how you know that. And it's just to do with the way we're conditioned, the way we learn language. It's a really common thing. Similarly, if people choose 4-digit,
I'm the odd one out. Then mine doesn't do
we lost that bit, unfortunately.
You just cut it for a moment there, Paul. Sorry.
Sorry. Anyway. So go ahead.
Okay. Oh, did you say you were one of those or not one of those?
No, I said I wasn't one of those.
Good for you.
I'm one in the team.
The other one is PIN codes when you use them. They, of course, as long as possible, 6 characters should be the minimum. Anything less than 4, that's also generally going to be the date of year of birth of somebody. That's pretty much the most common one. There are really good analysts out there who dump common passwords on the web for purposes of security companies, not tied to individuals, but just to show what are the most common passwords. And they then, you can talk to a group of 18-year-olds born in whatever, 1999, and if they've got 4-digit pins, it's likely going to be 1999. And that's just common user behavior. So yeah, good strong passwords, 6-digit lengths as a minimum. With mobiles, highly recommend you make a backup of your data, of course, because that's the device you're most likely to lose. Enable the Finder functionality. This goes for Android and iOS, so that in the event you can lose it. F-Secure and even the device manufacturers themselves have something on there that allows you to locate and remotely wipe your device in the event you lose it. And now that one is critical because, of course, we all store our emails, all sorts of sensitive information, photographs on mobiles. So if you know you're never going to get that back, you need to know that you can factory reset the device remotely, and that's something that can be done. That's really important in terms of email accounts, because one thing we know about users as well is that they tend to store passwords in emails. And if a hacker can get your email, then obviously they can log into your other accounts. And the third is to think about the location services and where you use your device. So good practice to disable Bluetooth if you're not actually using it, because that's a common threat mechanism. Similarly, if you are using Wi-Fi networks, you need to be careful about what Wi-Fi networks you're on, especially if you're traveling about, you're in a coffee shop or a train station. You can't be sure that that Wi-Fi network you've connected to isn't something that's been set up by a spoofer. If you Google how to create a fake Wi-Fi, do that in YouTube, you get something like 500 pages of hits. It's a really common attack mechanism, not just for criminals, but also for, good kiddies who want to have fun.
And let's be honest, the thing is as well, as soon as you see free Wi-Fi, everyone just jumps on it.
Yeah.
It's almost, I don't want to use the term, but it's almost like a drug. Because, most people are on limited data, though. You've got 5 gigs or whatever, so obviously it's precious. Or if you're traveling
we staged a stunt whereby we put a Herod clause into Wi-Fi access. Tom can describe it better than me.
Oh, okay. We set up a fake hotspot, so we just got we've got a Wi-Fi base station. We put some SIM cards in it, and we set it up around the House of Parliament a couple of years back. And we opened up the network for 30 minutes just to see who would connect. Now, we put a really clear set of T's and C's, and that, you know what T's and C's like for any internet service, pages and pages long. We kept it to one side of A4, and we put a bold print clause in there that stood out from all of the other text. That was, as Jeff just said, the Herod clause, which gave us the right to take your first unborn child. And And we couldn't have nailed it up more clearer. Anyway, we had in the region of a couple of hundred connections in 30 minutes, including, because of the nature of information you connect on devices, and the way certain mail clients share credentials, we could have, if we'd wished to, access the mail clients of people who connected to that network.
Wow, that's pretty profound.
That's fun. You're right. It's a drug people can't avoid.
So I guess actually we can move to a slightly different topic on this.
Anyway, I was kind of, we were given the negative bit, but the punchline was you got to be careful with it. So I'd recommend you use some kind of VPN if you're connected to Wi-Fi networks.
I was going to say actually, and that does lead us to VPNs, because VPNs, I mean, most people now know them for, let's say, circumventing block content. Like, I was in Norway recently, and the TV shows over there and the movies that were on Netflix were just like so much better than the UK. But they can be so much, obviously VPNs are so much more than, hey look, I'm circumventing Netflix. So do you feel that users are becoming more savvy with VPNs, and would you say that the usage cases, in other words, the percentage of users using VPNs is increasing?
Yeah, we do see that. So my colleagues on the marketing side have done some demographic analysis, and we see that particularly, let's say, in the under 30s and the more tech aware, there's a clear need or requirement for VPNs. And it isn't just about geographic anonymity.
I hate that word.
So there is an understanding that there is a security requirement, and also a concern that people don't want to be tracked by larger organizations. So every website you browse to has some kind of tracking cookies in it. Some of them are very persistent. You know, it's that freaky scenario that people see when they go looking for, let's say, sheds or flights, and then suddenly in their Gmail account they're seeing adverts for sheds and flights. So there are a number of drivers for that beyond just getting around content blocks by people like Netflix. I'd say actually that thing is a little bit understated as one of the fears that come from those companies, because the truth is if you want to get access to content, you don't need a VPN to do it. You know, Cody's obviously quite a big thing these days. There are a number of sites out there, Putlocker. If you're in the Nordics, you'd know Pirate Bay is a big thing out there. There's a number of sources that people can go to that they don't have to go through VPNs to get it. And we wouldn't recommend that, of course.
No. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, obviously because of, rights, digital rights and distribution rights and all of that, it kind of forces people to, no one wants to wait X amount of time, and if you've got a Netflix account and you know that the American Netflix has something or the Nordic Netflix has something and you've got the UK version, most people are just going to say, screw it, I'm just going to go with VPN, because you guys, for example, offer an excellent VPN service as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, that is a route. Actually, what I'm saying is that there is a way they can do it even without VPNs that's pretty easy today. So I don't think that's particularly specific to VPN, but you're right. I mean, the advent of streaming services has killed traditional torrent streams. It's
so much easier. I think that's the thing. Like, I just can't be bothered to do the whole downloading thing.
Yeah.
It's like for me, the server. I mean, obviously VPNs have the security, have the privacy, but for me, it's like just so much of a bonus, because I'll be honest, I'm lazy. I can't be bothered to, after I've worked for 10 or 12 hours, I then can't be bothered to go through, torrents and hope for the best that there's a good copy when, it's available probably on Netflix or, I don't know, Hulu or whatever else.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that's the great things about Netflix, and also, you could say Spotify is the big changer for music in that one as well, is that you can stream that content more easily. So interestingly, I don't know if you're aware, but Netflix are one of those companies that are really trying to fight back against anonymizing tools. So
they are.
Yeah, so they've started blacklisting or popping up warning lists if you are using VPNs, which is interesting in protecting their business model. But I think because we definitely see that the VPN, most usage amongst our customers is for security purposes. So although we don't track individual usage, we see global stats on which particular features of our products are used. So our Freedom product, which is the VPN, the geo-blocking feature is used by less than 10% of the people who have that client.
Wow. That's way less than what I'd assumed.
Yeah, honestly, that was a surprise to us as well, but you know, it was a good thing.
I thought it was going to be like more like 40%, 50%, a good percentage, basically. So I guess one of the, moving on from VPNs and into more generic terms, obviously one of the oldest threats out there has been something like viruses, malware. So how does something like one of your products, like,
are we losing some of what you're saying, unfortunately, Paul?
Okay, would you like me to start again? I think our connection's getting a little bad.
Yes, please.
Yeah, please do, yeah.
Okay, so obviously malicious software such as viruses which replicates and infects files. How does F-Secure's Safe Virus Protection scan and actually understand what is and what isn't a virus or a threat?
So, that's a big question. So, you know, obviously, like we said, we've been around for 30 years, so we have evolved significantly over the years. So, back in the day, most of this stuff was done by file reputation checking. So, we'd see a file, we'd be able to check some of the associated metadata with it, particularly the MD5 values, and then we'd be able to, you know, look at the digital signature and say known good or bad file. That's pretty how much all AV worked up to a point, up until the early 2000s. And then what we beyond that was the scale of the threats was just getting too big, and running a local database to check a file against just wasn't becoming sustainable anymore. That's when AV really started to get a bad name across the board, when users would see it, you know, really bloating out the system. Scans could take a long time, and they'd also take a lot of memory on the disk space. So F-Secure was one of the first companies back in 2005, and we started running cloud-based queries. So rather than relying on local signature base, we were looking at the reputation through our cloud. So we've got a component in our service, object reputation service, which is an encrypted back channel that runs from any client that's running it on the device, and it sends anonymized data to our cloud on the types of files it's scanning. So we're not looking at any user data, we don't track any IPs. Important to call it out, compared to certain companies that have got some heavy flack lately for being able to ingest particular files. And what we're doing is taking that into the cloud, and in the early days that would go into our main detection labs in Helsinki, although we have others in San Jose and Kuala Lumpur. And human analysts would then decompile things that we found that were or suspected of being malicious. And that worked well for a time, but again, just the sheer number of threats has grown to the point, you know, we're processing something like 400 and 420,000 malicious files a day.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is insane.
It is insane, and on top of that,
like
we process
3 to 4 million a week. That is ridiculous.
Yeah, and you'll get similar numbers from other security companies. We also look at something like 6 billion URL requests a day, because these are coming from coming from people who've got the clients running our clients on their devices. So you know, that point where we were dependent on human analysts is just, we're way beyond that. So there's a core component which I know you wanted to talk about of the antivirus, which is called DeepGuard. And DeepGuard was our first sort of heuristics engine, which we built in the mid-2000s, and we're now on the 6th version of that. And each version we have introduced iterations that speed up and change somewhat the way that it's worked to cope with demand and the different kind of threats we're seeing. So we move beyond people just dropping a payload, which would be some kind of macro running against a non-updated Windows file, to a point where we have more complex and harder to spot vulnerabilities, particularly when you talk about what are called 0 days. So something new or something that we haven't seen that's looking to exploit a vulnerability on a package. So we can't just, as we said earlier on, scan a file and have a look at it. We also need to see how it behaves. So we look at behavior and we look at prevalence. And what I mean by prevalence is how most applications that people use, 99% of them are legitimate and good known files, standard sort of plugins and applications that people run on different devices. So we can relatively easy whitelist those and say that they're good, and quite quickly process and move through those, and that helps us keep on top of false positives. And at the same time, the deep guard really concentrates on looking at anomalous behavior. So we'll look at a file that is trying to push escalated privileges, access files it shouldn't do, various behaviors like that. So what we do is, to a certain degree, for example, in the Windows client, what we used to do was run it in a sandbox, so we could let an application execute, monitor it, look at it, see if it's doing something malicious, and block it and flag it up. And then we push that into the cloud so that every other customer who's using our application within 60 seconds would get an update that says, right, we've seen this thing in the wild, we know it's bad, nobody else can access it. So if you got hit with something in London, within a couple of minutes, we can protect users in Australia.
That is really awesome. And I guess it's kind of one of those things where, as an end user, you don't really think of something because obviously, something pops up, this is blocked, malicious a threat with, X, and you don't really think about how the logistics of how that was kind of handled in the background, and how, a scan was, a scan on your PC, or just an event on your PC was, possibly one of the first instances of a threat. It's really awesome from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, we're losing you a little bit, Paul. So we can hear you, but you're cutting in and out somewhere. But
it's strange because you're perfectly fine for me. It must be, I don't know. What I'll do is I'll try to keep my sentences short. I think that's probably the best option.
Okay. Well, I got the gist of it. So yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's great, and we've seen, one of the things we've done is evolve our security over the years, and hey, we're a Finnish company, we're Nordic, and they're not culturally, Nordic people aren't facing, and this is kind of interesting because that's always come across in our software. So what we don't want to do is nag, and also minimize the amount of interactions. Again, especially in the residential world, most people don't want to know what we've done, and they don't want to make a choice. They just want to say, we've seen a threat and we've blocked it.
And that is obviously, this is, I guess, going to the wider gamut, so that would be more professional markets, HPC, big data.
Yeah.
Compromised admin accounts and other issues obviously can lead to massive data breaches of data. You've probably heard what happened with Tesla.
Yep.
Where, their telemetry data, and someone was using their AWS, Amazon Web Services, to mine. So can you tell us, like, how major data breaches typically happen? Obviously, multiple instances, multiple different causes. So how do these compromises actually generally happen in virtual computing environments? And how does your company, what are you trying to do to kind of mitigate this?
So we, just as an aside there, by the way, that mining is definitely a new trend. So the last,
I've noticed.
Yeah, the last year or two,
really common.
Yeah, the last year or two, hackers are always motivated by where they're going to make their money. So the last couple of years, it's all been about ransomware, because there's readily off-the-shelf exploit kits that they can buy. The stuff that was developed by predominantly the US government. It was dumped by the shadow brokers onto the web. Hackers can take that off-the-shelf kit and customize it a little bit and make themselves something nice and easy, lots of use a PC, and away they go. But because they're motivated by money, and they've just realized, obviously, Bitcoin's, well, okay, not done so well in the last few weeks, but generally the trend for Bitcoin has been just going through the roof. So if you can take somebody else's computing resource and start mining, that's an even easier win. Obviously, Bitcoin being, how do I phrase it? A hooky currency is maybe not the wrong way of phrasing it. It doesn't have the same kind of regulation that goes along with normal theft and normal money transactions. So it's almost a lower impact crime to commit if you take over somebody's servers and use mining. You're not going to get the same attention as if you've got gone out and encrypted a bunch of people's devices.
Or stole money from a bank, essentially.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So Yeah, oh gosh, we've had all sorts of things. Like we had the Swift thing, 2000 when was that? 2012. So that was when you mentioned whether the whole banking community was hit, particularly coming from Bangladesh, but where the payment money system was compromised. So you asked a massive question: how do corporates get impacted? So we've actually just put out an instant report that's come out today, and Jeff's put out the press release for it earlier on.
I'll send it on to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks. I'll throw it on screen when I've finished editing the interview.
There's some really interesting stats in it. Some of it I was aware of before, some of it I'm looking at with fresh eyes. You might hear a rustle of paper because I'm just looking at the figures as well. So a couple of things is looking at whether it's targeted or whether it's opportunistic. So, hackers can, it's relatively easy to remotely scan networks and look for vulnerabilities. There are lots of tools out there that can do that. So there's an element of, just throw a bunch of balls into the air and see if one of them gets in the net kind of approach. And then there's also the targeted attacks, which is either going to be, tends to be through looking at social attacks, targeting individuals within the company, finding out a little bit about them, seeing if they're attending, if they've got specific professional interests. They might be, for example, let's say hypothetically, somebody at a corporation might be looking at GDPR compliance. You can find that out quite easily by looking at somebody's LinkedIn profile or what their business interests are. You could see if they've attended particular conferences, because people always post this stuff on their Twitter feeds and LinkedIn. And then if you want to go after that individual, you could custom make an email in what we call a spear phishing attack, embed an attached document that says, hey, this is everything you need to know about GDPR, and you can get a particular user's device infected through that mechanism. So the targeted attacks we see account for about 55% of the hits that companies we've worked with are getting, against 45% of the opportunistic. And that spear phishing is about 16% of it. Malicious emails, attachments is another 18%. So about a third of users are getting things through emails themselves. And we see lots of hacks in that way, targeted at every part of the business. At F-Secure, we've had interesting, we monitor this stuff a lot. We've seen attacks targeted at our CEOs and our financial teams. Companies pretending to send invoices. Invoice might load and it contains some backdoor which looks to try and infect a system.
So how does this, in terms of the HPC, like big data and servers,
right,
is it similar in that as well? Like, so a user account gets compromised because they've left some data on their their local system, which obviously they're using to, let's say, RDP to the virtual machine, or is it kind of a different attack mechanism?
Yeah, in most instances, what the hackers are looking to do is try and get something onto the corporate network that they can then sniff around for what's interesting. So right, the initial exploit will come in typically the way I've just described. It can come through other ways, like actually through insiders is quite a big one. People just having poor security practice. We've done some really...
Tesla.
Yeah.
I think they used the default password or something like that. I can't remember, but it was something ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, and so what they'll do is try and deploy something in the system. Now we're past the days where in these kind of scenarios where hackers would then instantly try and launch some payload that would compromise the system. They are way more intelligent than that. So they're more likely to sit quietly, inactive, and only wake up in situations where certain flags are seen. For example, they can deploy probes within a network that will sniff around looking for servers or some way of escalating privileges. And that's, I wouldn't say easy, but it's definitely something that's happening, because we know that even the profile of a device can tell you a lot about it and who has access to it. So they're looking to try and always escalate the privileges somehow so they can get to different parts of the network, particularly into server environments. Some of the servers, like you said, the Tesla one was a crazy password. The Sony one that happened a couple of years ago was a defunct server which just hadn't been decommissioned and had access to data on it, which then meant they could, extract lots of stuff from the Sony networks. So what we see is the compromise. A lot of the organizations we work with actually come to us after they realize something's happened, unfortunately. And then when we're doing the forensics, we can see that the infection levels are typically somewhere between 4 and 6 months before a breach has been detected.
Wow, that is ridiculous.
Yeah, and that's to do with the increasingly smarter nature of the criminals. They're in the scenario where, so they might get some payload on there which is going to go sniffing, but after that they're not using any particular tools because they want to evade detection. Most companies will have some kind of endpoint or some other security happening at a cloud level. So they're trying to avoid security companies. So what they'll do is look to access, just good tools. So standard admin tools that would be run to run a network. Hackers will try and leverage those rather than always inflict some virus attack.
Yeah, I mean, for example, with the Tesla thing, one of the ways they avoided detection was limit the CPU usage that they were using for the mining.
Yeah.
Because obviously, if you're putting like 100% of a system's resources towards mining, it's going to look a bit suspicious. If you limit that to several percent, then you can kind of get away with that for longer, right?
That's exactly it. So you've nailed it. I mean, that's a great example of staying below the radar. Because hackers, criminals, when they're motivated by money, they don't want to get caught. They're not in this for fun anymore. So they will do their best to stay low profile.
Moving away from the HPC in cloud, let's talk about the big elephant in the room, and that's Spectre and Meltdown, which obviously is a more chip-sized vulnerability.
Yeah.
So I guess there's a couple of different ways we can ask this. First of all, how did it kind of emerge in your company? Like, what were your thoughts in your company? Did you kind of feel, oh my god, this is huge, or were you not panicking, but like, all hands on deck? What were your thoughts basically when you first heard about this vulnerability? Did you realize it was a massive deal?
I'd say the hitchhikers thing, don't panic, certainly applied. I mean, undoubtedly it's big, but we've been around long enough and involved enough security incidents to know that we need a measured response and understand the implications of it. Massive as they are, the impact is rather to obviously shared server environments, certainly for Meltdown. And although there's a lot of really cool technology involved in how these exploits work, now, I don't want to understate their risk at all, but Spectre, for example, is much less of an impact in real world. Let's say the Meltdown requires physical access and a lot higher technical expertise, and also it's a more difficult one for anybody to go after. Meltdown certainly is certainly one that has caused a lot of headaches. One of the headaches actually we saw was one of the first bug fixes that was pushed out by Microsoft. You might have heard there was a lot of blue screening taking place.
Yeah.
Oops. Oh gosh, there's been so much of that. I mean, some of the quality of the bug updates that have been coming out, both from the chip vendors and some of the root manufacturers or hardware vendors, sorry, and also software bugs have been problematic.
Would you say it's because they've been panicking and just trying to get something out there?
Yeah, that it certainly feels like that from the hardware side. Windows or Microsoft have a kind of more measured approach, I would say, even if we've had issues with it. I mean, a lot of the blue screening that Microsoft saw with their updates was because certain AV companies were using no other way to phrase it other than hooky kernel access calls to make their software work. And when Microsoft were pushing out their updates, there was conflicts between those, which was causing the blue screening.
Right.
So they fixed that one in January by making sure AV companies put a flag, which was basically saying false or true, and making sure that they worked with that update. And happily, we were one of the ones that were already compliant because we tend to work fairly closely with Microsoft anyway. We don't want to break their systems. We know we have to work with what we got.
So I guess a logical question, because you touched on there's Meltdown being considerably more severe. So in, I guess, layman terms, because Spectre and Meltdown are vulnerabilities in modern processors, which takes advantage of speculative execution. So in layman's terms, could you explain the differences between Spectre and Meltdown, and why these vulnerability exists, and what you have done to kind of mitigate the issue?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So Meltdown mainly affects Intel chipsets, pretty much exclusively, in fact. And what it's really doing is looking at it's looking at the way processors work today, which is to run multiple tasks in tandem or in parallel to get efficiencies in processing power. So if it's been asked to, if a chip receives a request from some part of the platform to do, for example, a memory fetch, it will start running that query. Then it will receive a second query to do another task, and it won't have received the full commands for that query, but it will start it in any case, because if it gets it wrong, then it can throw that away. If it gets it right, there's an efficiency gain and you have a quicker working chipset. What the researchers discovered, I think the Google guys who originally pushed it out first, was that what that does is when you do, for example, a memory dump, you get an export into a cache from memory in the kernel, and you can measure the difference between these outputs in terms of latency. And you can then, using JavaScript, you can query that and effectively fetch data from the memory dumps. And I don't know if that was very layman term or even particularly well explained.
To be honest, I would say that the audience for this channel would understand that because they're fairly technically proficient. But I can always throw a couple of examples on screen anyway, so I'm guessing that would be kind of in the realms of what most people would understand the channel. So I can always add a little bit of extra, some notes or something anyway. Yeah. Or perhaps you guys can throw some marketing information towards me on this, and then that would be
I mean, F-Secure, we did some really good response stuff, so we can put that in there as well.
Okay, that would be fantastic. So would you like to continue?
Yeah, Spectre worked actually in a very similar way, but instead of allowing direct access to kernel memory or caching, is instead actually looking for access to elevated privilege to get into that system. So it's trying to trick another part of the system to allow you access to it. And it affects other chips than Intel. I think AMD were some of the ones that were hit with it to an extent. But the scale and the impact in terms of the amount of chips, it's way less than what hit Intel.
Because speaking of Intel, there was another vulnerability on Intel thanks to AMT. But this does require physical access as far as I'm aware.
Yes.
And actually F-Secure, I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong, unfortunately, but I think his name is Harry Sintonen. And he... sorry, did I pronounce that incorrectly?
No, you did it pretty well. I mean, with Finnish names, they roll a lot their R's. I can't actually do that myself, so you did pretty well as far as I can say.
Okay, so what he showed was, on camera as well, how easy it was to exploit the device. So even if a BIOS password is set, you can basically put in a USB device, and then assuming the manufacturers had followed Intel's guidelines, so the device can be made essentially vulnerable. So can you discuss how this vulnerability was discovered, and do you feel that the situation could have been resolved by perhaps a better configuration with Intel, or was it more down to OEMs or users, or do you feel this is just something that no one could have really predicted, and so on really?
Yeah. First of all, how it came about. So Harry is part of the guys mainly in Helsinki, whose job it is really to do this kind of thing. So they'll kick around with all sorts of hardware, ranging from traditional kind of work environment machines to the shiny new internet-enabled kettles, toasters, video cameras, etc. So they've got fun jobs. In terms,
I was going to say that sounds bloody fun.
and I mean, we quite often take in terms of hardware. We've got a good relationship with a lot of vendors. It's kind of hard to keep up with the explosion that's going on these days. But in the past, we used to get ship kit from a lot of mobile phone vendors and gaming vendors. We get multiple versions of the kit because people like Harry and colleagues elsewhere will, first they'll physically break the device, because they want to look around and see what it looks like inside. You know, once you break it, what can you get access to the chipset? Is there anything unusual there? And then they'll start playing around with the drivers, the software, and the performances on it. So Harry, in the course of his work looking at, and it was a little bit inspired by what we saw with the chip work, was trying to see what else you could do at a BIOS level.
Right.
And that's how we came across and discovered the particular vulnerability related to the AMT. Now, it only, of course, affects, we pretty much only see it in corporate environments, and as you say, it requires kind of physical access, but it's pretty trivial to execute in terms of, you know, you can access the MEBR on a machine at boot up level, so it doesn't require, you know, any user credentials or any user access.
So to give, sorry, just to interject just for 1 second. So
Sure.
that would be something like if you were, let's say, getting coffee in a coffee shop, and you would only need like the 30 seconds or the minute or whatever to kind of go to the device while the person was getting a coffee, basically, right?
Yeah, it's as simple as that. You can get access to a device pretty simply. Corporate environments as well, you know, people do tend to leave their machines for various reasons, you know, going to lunch or whatever, and you get occasional randoms coming in for, you know, people enter our workspaces all the time doing service kind of function orientated, you know, roles, like everything from cleaning the windows to watering the plants. Our guys we have a cyber security division who do a lot of red teaming, and
They're carrying the banana thing. You can get away with a lot if you just walk into a building carrying a banana or carrying some papers.
Oh, okay.
Quite often don't attract attention.
Okay.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, one I do know works is walking in with a stepladder and appearing to do some kind of work. I've had access to environments in the past myself where, you know, just being friendly to a receptionist or can get you through into places where you shouldn't be. So, you know, F-Secure has taken on assignments in the past where we've been given a goal of targeting a specific server in a physical environment in a building, and using really kind of basic techniques, you can get into a work environment.
That's ridiculous. So it's almost like
It really is
espionage
as well.
in a way.
I mean, we
almost...
do stuff like we look at access systems and cameras. The amount of times I've seen control access systems, so, you know, the pin things that we point our cards at are our RFID tags to get into offices. Sometimes you'll get the sensors for those get installed on the outside. People don't realize that that's something that hackers can take advantage of. There's all sorts of fun ways of getting into buildings and people's computers.
That's awesome.
So,
sorry, go.
No, go on.
I was just gonna say. So, when this was discovered, do you feel that AMT? Do you feel that Intel should have had a better configuration, or do you feel like it was something that realistically no one could have predicted would have had the vulnerability discovered? Or
yeah, I'm not going to come down too hard on them. I mean, vulnerability we kind of discovered quite a while ago, and we've kind of released it to them in the time-on approach of giving them fair warning to get it fixed first, and that's how you should sort of highlight these issues. And it's more of a configuration issue or a design thing rather than a system flaw. There are legitimate reasons why people might have this as a feature in a corporate world. I just don't think it was particularly well understood or promoted that, you know, it's the password that needs to be changed.
Right. So it was more poor communication as well.
But maybe an element of that, yeah. I mean, we've seen things in the past, I'm trying to remember the name of it now, but Apple had a backdoor which was a similar thing onto their platforms a couple of years ago, where you could go in under an admin and exploit, get across their different systems. It's something that we see commonly, you know, that I don't think there isn't a week goes by where there isn't some bypass to a password on a platform at some level because there is a default password. I mean, this, of course, was a clear error in allowing the fact that you could put in any password and get through. That's a little bit more than unusual, but even just having defaults is something that we see increasingly coming out of devices, and that's you know, in large part, let's face it, you know, despite what we've had recently, Windows and the chipset vendors, particularly AMD, are pretty good. ARM are pretty good at building security as models into it. But
I mean, I remember back in the day. I mean, this is obviously going back quite a long time, but Windows 98. I think it was like the first edition. You guys probably remember this better than I do, but there was like an exploit where if you connected to the internet, there was that vulnerability that basically would force your system to reboot because it would download some virus or another onto your system. And a couple of my friends got that. I can't remember what it was called. It basically, you didn't even have to download anything. It was like almost like scanning IP addresses to see which systems were vulnerable.
We're losing some of what you're saying, unfortunately, Paul.
Okay, it was like Windows 98 was very, very susceptible to vulnerabilities.
Well, hey, they've learned over time, Windows. I said they're good at it recently. I'm not saying in the past. You know, there's a reason that security companies like us exist is because there were huge amounts of vulnerability.
Do you feel UAC has helped with that?
Where it's used, yes, I do. Yeah, you know, that was one of the sort of basics that we give to our consumers is enable it and make sure you can't install things unless you've got admin rights. I'd question actually how many people use it.
Right. So it's kind of a lot of those things. It's there, but not enough people use it.
Yeah, especially not in the consumer world. Obviously, it's a kind of given in the corporate world.
How are we doing for time? Because we've got about 5 minutes until the end of the hour that we'd allotted.
I'm okay.
I'm good.
Paul's okay.
Yeah, I'm good. I mean, we've not got that many questions left anyway, so I'm happy just to finish off the most pertinent ones because we've covered a couple just naturally as we've gone through anyway. Like we've gone through Deep Guard, for example. So there's a couple of other ones, and then we can call it.
Okay.
So I guess one of the big... I mean, you guys have been around for 30 years, but what would you say is the biggest changes over, say, the past 5 years?
The biggest change in the last 5 years. So... I think 5 years. If you think, I think one of the biggest changes we've seen is perhaps this is talking a little bit now the kind of attacks that people get because a lot of stuff still comes through email. That hasn't changed. And the motivational for all this stuff, like we've spoken about already, is people trying to make money at the end of the day. That was something that happened about 10 years ago. An interesting development is that a lot of the hacking kits that are used these days are increasingly being shared amongst the community. So if we think back to the WannaCry thing that hit everybody in the middle of last year, that was using a couple of exploit kits built by the US government, Eternal Blue and Double Pulsar, which were in turn hacked by they were in turn exposed because they were, we believe, exploited by Russians, who were in turn hacked by Israelis, who were in turn hacked by Koreans. And we've kind of got a vicious circle of government agencies looking to create backdoors which inevitably leak out into the wild and get reused by criminals for other reasons. And that's been a concern. It's maybe not such a recent topic, but ever since the Snowden stuff revealed the extent of what governments are getting up to. And I don't see that as in any way a good thing when governments are effectively weaponizing software.
Yeah, they're essentially nukes, but for software, basically.
And you know, intelligence services are always going to act in a certain way because that's their job, just to function and kind of spy and protect us in some method like that. But maybe I think the license they're given is being overextended. It's kind of particularly rich for, you know, countries that traditionally pride themselves as being democratic to kind of use these tools for spying, and then cry foul when North Korea, Iraq, Israel, whatever, are doing. Have we lost you, Paul?
No, yeah, just for a second. Just for a second.
Okay.
I have no idea what's going on with this connection. It was fine like this morning, but I'm actually at I'm actually at Amy's house today recording because basically I've had problems with a microphone, so I was like, you know what, it's just simpler just to come here. Ironically, now she's having internet issues apparently, so it's like sod's law, it's like smacking me upside the head.
Yeah, it's always the way, unfortunately.
So
can I add another one on that one as well? Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say as well, I guess another logical one would be when it comes to ransomware.
Oh, that was exactly what I was going to hit.
Yeah, what would you actually suggest? Like, I mean, I think most people know what ransomware is, and obviously you spoke about it briefly, but if your system was compromised with ransomware, what would you do? I mean, for the layman, is it even worth paying the ransom? Is it worth trying to pay a security specialist to unencrypt your drive? I mean, what would you do?
So, gosh, that's a huge question. I mean, when we first saw ransomware, which would be like, actually, do you know what? We first saw ransomware 20 years ago.
Wow.
And some of the flop screens we see, like for the ransom demands, they pretty much look now like they did then as well. The difference was that they didn't encrypt anything. You know, they would do some kind of file locking or hiding your content in a file that, you know, you could kind of use an offline virus cleaner, boot off the system, and you could get your content back. That was pretty straightforward. But that really did change about 3-4 years ago with CryptoLocker, where you started to get software which is genuinely encrypting, and encrypting using pretty good standards. Not always easy to get hold of, and in fact, in the more recent cases, virtually impossible. You know, they're using decent crypto. If that content has been locked, in many cases, you're not going to get it back. So it then moves on to the kind of morality question of, do you pay? It's hard for me to say, give you a hard that says you should never do it. We know through examples of kind of acting out certain scenarios in these situations with infected that you can negotiate with criminals and get ransoms reduced. So one of our colleagues, our chief research officer, Mikko Huppinen, did this as an exercise, testing it through. Just said, look, hey, can't afford to pay this fee, and the hackers came back and offered a reduced fee to get it done. So we've also though got recent scenarios, and WannaCry again would be a good example of this, is where paying the ransom, you don't get your content back.
Yeah, I have heard that. Yeah. Sometimes they just be like, thanks, and that's basically it. It's just, you're screwed, and obviously now you're out of money as well.
Yeah, I mean, the standard security advice we're supposed to say is never go and engage with them, but I would say it very much depends upon what is your personal circumstances. You know, if you don't have backups of that data and it's critical to your life or your business, we can't say that you can't try to use any method to get it back.
I was going to say, which really comes down to make sure you've got backup. Make sure you've got backups, people.
Yeah, get backup and make sure you've got something on you that protects you from ransomware. I mean, we're pretty good at detecting and blocking that stuff.
Right. And so, you heard it here, guys. Make sure that you have a backup and a guard as well against it, because, you know, if you've got something that's pretty much critical to your life, you're screwed. I guess,
positive way to end.
Yeah, well, there's actually one or two last questions, and then, you know, we can quickly wrap up. But,
yeah, I'm really sorry but I've got one other thing to say about trends, which I really should have said as well.
Sure, go for it.
So, biggest trend, biggest thing that's made a world of difference in terms of cybercrime, and apologies for hearing the church bell in the background, is cryptocurrencies. They're massively changed the ease with which criminals can generate relatively anonymous currency. So, you know, the idea of kind of 5 to 10 years ago, I don't know if you've heard of money mules, but that was a really big thing. So if you could get something on somebody's device that could get their credit card details, or, you know, rob money somehow, you then had to take that money and do it in a way that didn't leave an audit trail coming back to you, because then the police are going to come back after you. So money mules were people that would be recruited by spam, and essentially, you know, think they were taking some kind of admin job, but really what they'd be doing is moving money from bank account to bank account on behalf of the criminals, maybe without realizing it. And so there was a kind of whole value chain within the process of guys who write the code, guys who distribute the software, and then people who convert the money. Cryptocurrency's changed that massively. You know, it's taken out a huge, complex step for criminals in how they convert, you know, the actual cash into something that they can go away and spend.
I guess because we are kind of running short of time at the moment, so there's a couple of last questions that I want to ask. The first one is, now that services are more cloud-orientated, data now on social media, online banking, as you said, cryptocurrencies, I guess predict the future as best you can. How do you feel that security is going to change over the next 3 to 5 years, and how are you as a company kind of bracing yourselves for that?
Yeah, we are much more concerned, and there's a general push in everyone from the industry is to get security built in by design. 90% of stuff that we see come through the door could be prevented. So we've spoken a bit about default passwords, making sure whatever your internet-enabled toaster is not accessing open Wi-Fi networks and sharing those credentials out. There's no backdoors on. There's really simple ways to do that. We will see secure. So that's a kind of push from the security industry, and it's increasingly being understood all over around the world. That said, you know, we're still going to get lots of compromised devices going on. So from a security perspective, we will and are moving less away from protection on endpoint devices, because there's way more operating systems and devices out there today that we can't put security, endpoint security on. So we need to instead look at understanding when a device has been compromised. And increasingly we are making the assumption that something has been compromised, and how do we spot it? So a lot of what security services in the future will look like are probes that can sense networks, whether it's a home office or a home, somebody's house, or an office company. Sensors within that network that can look at the traffic that's moving across it, and use machine learning and AI and all that good stuff to understand what is good traffic patterns and what is bad traffic patterns. So we're going to move away from endpoint to an area where we're just monitoring traffic and looking for malicious things.
Right. So last two questions before we wrap up. First one is a bit silly, and the last one I guess is going to be interesting for an answer. So a common concern at the moment is with autonomous vehicles. I mean, obviously in theory they're safer, but AI, robots, all this stuff, one of the common concerns is not that necessarily Skynet is going to happen, but instead something's going to be hacked. So for example, your autonomous vehicle is going to be hacked, or something is injected into that vehicle which tells it to drive off a cliff, for example.
Yeah.
You know, obviously it might sound a bit silly, but you don't know how technology is going to evolve 3-5 years time. Well, do you feel that this is something that could happen, that, you know, that as lives become increasingly, I guess, down to automation, security on those areas? I mean, even your home, for example. I mean, now that, you know, homes are becoming increasingly like, I guess, smart homes. Do you feel that this is something that we, you know, as a society are going to become more aware of?
Well, I hope we become more aware of it. It is a thing. I mean, you mentioned the Tesla hack earlier on today. You know, I don't know if you know that there was also a hack on an actual Tesla car 3-4 years ago done by a security.
Oh, really?
In India. Yep. So he was able to get access to the onboard memory on the computer. So we actually do a lot of work ourselves with automotive and aeronautical companies. And there's a huge amount in those sectors going into, you know, everything from physical separation of systems, making sure that, you know, anything that runs the engine can't access onboard computers, or if, you know, if you think of the Tesla car, it's a web server on wheels. You know, it takes HTTP requests, you can query it and all that kind of stuff. So there's physical separations of environment, there's, you know, logical separations in terms of who can access what and privileges. So I'm not saying that those things won't happen, but those industries are acutely aware of the challenges they have. I'm would be more concerned today about the lower cost electronic goods that, you know, are so easy to produce, and everything's going to be smart soon, you know, whether we like it or not. And by smart we mean connected to the internet, not smart in terms of security. The chipsets are cheaper, the always-on connectivity is cheaper, and whether you want your toaster to talk to the internet isn't going to be a question you're offered 2 or 3 years' time, because it's useful for the manufacturer to ship that device with something internet-enabled on it, because they want to know things about performance and warranty, and every electronic consumer organization is kind of thinking like that. Right. So we are concerned about poor security in lower-cost electronic devices, you know, as a way of people being able to access home networks or distribute spam, or, you know, maybe even in the future, well, I can't see toaster being used for Bitcoin mining, but, you know,
but
the extends.
In theory, it could be damaged. For example, with a toaster, if the internal sensor was hacked so it didn't realize it was getting up to a temperature, it could possibly cause fires or whatever else as well, right? In theory.
In theory, I'm less concerned by the physical damage that these things will do, because again, the motivation for people who are taking these crimes out isn't to cause that kind of harm. There's no financial benefit in it for them. But there is, you know, if they can make that part, if they can make your kettle or your fridge part of a botnet that can take down a network somewhere, it's the processing power that's more interesting to them. It's always about how can they monetize this.
Right. And I guess the last question we should ask, because, well, we're kind of running out of time. I'm realizing you guys are like already running quite behind schedule.
Okay.
But from a business security perspective, would you prefer users, or does it not make much of a difference, use Android or iOS or some other type of device? I mean, the benefit obviously of iOS is you've got the walled garden approach. With Android, there's new versions released quite frequently, but the problem is then that needs to be customized for different handset manufacturers.
Yeah.
Now, full disclosure, I'm using Android, but I do also understand that Apple have some benefits to it. Do you think it really makes much of a difference? And do you also feel that antivirus is imperative on a phone? And, you know, what's your kind of take on that? Hello?
Yeah, we lost you for a moment, but I got the question. Yeah, so it is clear that Apple, and particularly on iPhone, so I want to make a distinction between Macs, Apple have a better security model. You know, it's locked down, there's limitations on what you can do, unlike Android, which makes it less interesting for geeks, but the impact is their security model is better in terms of it's almost impossible unless you've got a jailbroken iPhone to put some malicious application on it. That doesn't mean they're not vulnerable, of course, because it's still the same internet, so you're still vulnerable to, you know, phishing sites, privacy, data leakage, other ways through the iPhone. But yeah, iPhone is a clearly safer system than Android. If you are running an Android phone, then yes, you definitely need some kind of AV. If you're using either an Android or an iPhone and you're connecting to Wi-Fi networks, then you should be using a VPN. That's regardless of whichever system you're using.
And do you feel that this is going to become less of an issue in the future as these these operating systems are updated, or do you think it's just kind of part and parcel? I mean, obviously you can't do much about the web side of things, but more about the security and escalation or vulnerabilities locally to the device.
Yeah, I don't see it particularly changing. I mean, the threat model continually evolves, and whenever something new is patched, something else pops up in the background that we hadn't seen before.
It's almost like weed whacking.
It is exactly like that, yeah.
Alright guys, I realise that you're kind of running late, so I don't want to keep you any longer, but it's been amazing talking to you. Perhaps we can schedule something in the future with more complex questions, but I figure it's good to kind of get a groundwork in the future.
Quickly, what are the next steps from your side then?
Pardon?
What are the next steps from your side, please?
Oh, so what we'll do, if you guys send over any, I guess, if you have any footage, any promotional footage, or whatever else that you want to kind of have in the background of the video, that would be amazing. If you have any press releases or whatever that would be pertinent to certain topics, that would also be amazing. And then what we'll do over the next several days, is we'll start editing the video, and we'll send a draft version over to you, so that you guys can kind of check it out and see if there's any changes you'd like to make, perhaps on the visual side of things, and then it will go live, and we'll tweet it and do whatever else promotion.
Sounds good.
Okay, so with all of that said, thanks very much for the interview. It's been amazing speaking to both of you, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Good luck with that.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Okay then, bye.
Bye.